Hello and thanks for watching my demonstration on Cisco UCS integration with Microsoft. In this demonstration, we're going to walk through the process of building up a brand new Cisco UCS system using PowerShell. What I'm showing here is our UCS emulator. It's our latest 222C emulator posted on Cisco.com, and you can download that for free. With this emulator, if you notice from a configuration standpoint, the only thing that the emulator does that's a little different than a real system is it does configure the uplink ports for the chassis and for the FEXs. So you notice that those are done. Beyond that, though, if we go in here and look, we're going to see that we have, for example, no Fibre Channel ports configured. If we go over to the Servers tab, we're going to see, as it pulls up the database here, we're going to see all of the information just sitting at factory default. That includes things like the default pools that don't have any entries in them, our finance suborg that the system likes to put in there, again, some other default pools. But if we go look at things like our BIOS policies, it's just the two defaults, our default boot policies. If we go over to the LAN tab, we're going to notice that there's no uplink ports or port channels configured anywhere in the system. From a VLAN perspective, we're just going to have our VLAN 1. If we look at our various policies, everything again is just sitting at the defaults that the emulator has in it. We've got no NIC templates whatsoever. From an IP pools perspective, our management pool is empty, size is 0. We've got this other pool that's been created by default, and then Mac pool is just our defaults. Go over to the SAN tab. Same thing here on the SAN tab. If we look, we've got no uplinks or Fibre Channel port channels created. From a vSAN perspective, if we look at our vSANs, all that's in there is our default vSAN 1. Again, no VHBAs, and just our default pools for our WWPNs and such. And then on the admin tab, if we go over and we look at what I would call the basics for administration, we're going to notice that in here, we've got under our management interfaces just the default name for the system and default domain, but no other details provided. DNS has just got our entry. Give it just a second to paint here. It'd just be our entry for the default, and then for NTP, it's not set, and we don't have any NTP servers. So again, as we can see, that this is pretty much a factory fresh UCS, which is the defaults that the emulator likes to put in there. So let's kind of switch over here, and I've got PowerShell up, and what I can do with PowerShell here is anything. So what I've done is I've put together this add UCS domain script. In this script you can just run this, and what it's got is thousands of lines of code which access UCS Manager, and will use an answer file, which I have over here, a sample of the answer file. We'll walk through that here in just a moment, but it uses that answer file to actually go ahead and build the entire UCS system. So briefly looking through the answer file, I start out by giving you some descriptions about how it works, and then in each section there is full documentation available to you. So first thing is, is this being run against a UCS emulator, yes or no? The only reason that I ask that question is the UCS emulator does not like to have the chassis and FEXs re-acknowledged. If it does, it throws errors. Everything works fine, it just throws errors. So I just have it skip the process of doing the re-acknowledgement of the chassis after discovery if you tag that. The My UCS, well, that's the IP address for managing your UCS. So process of turning up a UCS system is plugging with the Cisco Blue Console, walking through a short scripted menu that asks you things like what would you like the IP addresses to be, the administrator username, password, are you part of a cluster, just some basic things to get the system up. And from there you can manage everything else with UCS Manager through the IP network. And so this is the IP address of the management interface of your UCS domain. Then we get down, and I have this thing in here called UCS Domain Identifier. And what you can see in the description here is I use this field to simply monitor, manage what your UCS domain number is going to be, so that I prevent from duplicating MAC addresses, WWPNs, UUIDs, IQNs, things like that. So for example, if you were putting in your very first UCS domain, I might have that value set to 01. Then if I put another UCS system in right next to it, all I'd have to do from this answer file, if I was going to have kind of this data center stamp, is I would update the IP address information, and I would make that a 02 to make that my second UCS domain. And it's going to go into each one of the pools that get built and update it so I don't end up with a duplicate. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So we'll go ahead and set it back to its default that I'm using here in my lab of FF. Then I'm going to ask you about things like boot policies. Do you have any booting from local hard drives going on? Do you do any boot from Fibre Channel SAN? Do you have any boot from iSCSI? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it to yes. It's going to build boot policies for all 3 different types of environments that could live in a UCS domain. It asked me about, from a power perspective, am I doing 4 power supplies in grid mode, 3 power supplies with N+1, as an example. Then it comes down and it asks me about what ports are being connected as server ports. So again, being that this is the emulator, it's going to skip this part and not do the react, but you could identify how many ports were being used, what the slot number is, and what the port numbers are being used to feed down and hook to servers. And that would be for FEXs or for chassis. And then you've got your northbound LAN. So this will actually get configured, and it's going to configure these 4 ports on each fabric interconnect, slot 1, 29 through 32, to be uplink ports for LAN connectivity northbound of the UCS domain. And then it's going to ask me, well, are those ports being used just as individual uplinks, or are those port channels? So what we'll see here is I've defined that yes, I am using port channels. The name of the port channel on the A fabric interconnect is this Nexus 1 port 5 through 8, and the LAN port channel number is 1. And then on the B fabric, the name of the port channel and what port channel number that is. Continuing on here is what am I using as far as ports for Fibre Channel? So in this case, I'm using slot 2, so an expansion module in my fabric interconnect, and ports 13 through 16 for Fibre Channel. And then it's going to ask me the same kind of functionality of, hey, if I'm connected to an MDS, do I want to use SAN port channels, and if so, what's the name of the port channels and the port channel numbers? Now, being that this is Fibre Channel, I also need to identify things like what's my vSAN on the A and B fabric, and then since that's carried in FCOE between the chassis and the fabric interconnect, what's the VLAN that's being used for that? So there are my VLAN identifiers. Continuing on here, since I'm going to have Fibre Channel in this environment, I'm going to build some HBAs. So what do I want to call the HBA on the A fabric and on the B fabric? And then we continue on down and we get to the concept of booting from SAN. So in the boot from SAN environment, what I've got is ports connected to the various controllers. So controller A on the SAN, controller B on the SAN, and as we can see, those crisscross between the A fabric and B fabric to provide redundancy. I provide a count for those ports, what port number it is actually on the controller, what is the name of that port, and then what is the WWPN of that port. And so that identifies all the ports on my array. And then what I've got here is this concept of a boot matrix. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating multiple boot policies so that I can identify, maybe in a round-robin fashion as I build new servers, for them to belong to different boot policies, so that in the event of a boot storm, say after a large maintenance, I want to power on all of my servers. It's going to have various servers boot off of the different WWPNs on my SAN array, so that I don't put all the load on one port, causing the boots to be slower. So I'm optimizing automatically with this matrix here how my system boots. from a naming convention, I've just by default set it's Fibre Channel ports 1526, and as we can see, that's 1526. And how that relates back here is that is this count 1, 5, 2, and 6 being the counts. And then, since I'm using also iSCSI in this environment, I'm going to build a couple iSCSI NICs, iSCSI A and B, that could be used for boot. I am using a pool of built-in IP addresses versus using DHCP for the assignment for the IP addresses for those NICs during their boot. There's a default pool for iSCSI inside UCS, and you can't delete it. So I always just put in some, I'll put a placeholder information, just so I don't have an alarm in the UCS based on an empty pool. And then what I do is I go down here and I like to build a iSCSI Initiator Pool A and give it the information for that network. And then I'll go ahead and build an iSCSI Initiator Pool B and give it the IP information for that one. And then we go in here and we've got my target IP addresses and kind of a default IQN called Change Me. So I remember to give each one of my servers their own IQN to boot off of. Here's an IQN pool for the initiator side that I've built. And then we have some global information here that this is showing me all the QoS settings available in UCS. And I can adjust those as necessary to make the system work in my environment the way I would like it to, which I have done. And basically what I'm doing here, if we look at the last one here, is my Platinum QoS. I show all the default settings, but then here are the values. So do I have it enabled, yes or no? What's the cost value? Is there dropping or no dropping of packets? What is the weight? What's my MTU? For example, I'm using jumbo frames instead of just normal MTU. Am I doing multicast optimization for this queue? What's my burst and line rate? And then do I have host control for that? So all my custom settings have been set for QoS. Then I go down here and I have this kind of interesting matrix which is used for multiple things around the LAN. So the first thing is by having this VLAN name in here with a VLAN number, well, I'm going to build a VLAN, for example, Pixie VLAN 11. I'm also going to build a MAC address pool since I have an entry in here of 01 or something. I'm going to build a MAC pool called Pixie, which is going to consist of a MAC address that's going to be 0025B5. So that's the first half saying, hi, I'm Cisco. Then it's going to put in that domain ID that we saw at the beginning of the script, so FF in this environment, followed by 01, and then the pools are always 256 in size, so it's going to then be 00 through FF. And then it's going to go ahead and build a NIC, and that NIC is going to use standard MTU. That NIC is going to prefer to go out my A fabric with failover to my B fabric, and it will have QoS policy called best effort. So as you can see here, I'm going to build multiple NICs and multiple VLANs and multiple pools with their own custom settings. Like this one happens to have a jumbo MTU. This one is using the B fabric with failover to the A fabric, and it's using a different QoS policy. If we look a little farther down in this answer file, we also have the ability to do things like trunking VLANs. So for example, here I've got the VLAN called management, which we already built above. And because I didn't create or put an entry in here, it's going to skip building the actual VLAN itself. Because I skipped putting in the MAC address, it's going to skip building the pool for the MAC pool, because again, those had already been created above. But it is going to build a new NIC, and that NIC is this trunk NIC called VM Network. And that VM Network is going to automatically have my management VLAN added to it. So as you can see here, I'm creating a NIC that has multiple VLANs trunked underneath it. And then here, I'm coming down here and I'm building another VLAN, 19, called the VLAN, but it's not going to get its own NIC. It is going to, after being created with just a VLAN number, then I'm going to add that VLAN to my trunk NIC. So NIC on A, for example, showing here, under the VLAN is going to be NIC on A is going to have VLAN 19, the VLAN in it. And then let's move on down here and we talk about the default VLAN for the northbound out of the UCS. What is that? If I'm doing PXE for PXE booting with, say, something like a WDS server or something, then identify which NIC is my PXE boot. For IPMI, what is the default password for IPMI? I always remind my customers to go change that. Then if I'm using multicast courier, what is the IP address for the courier? What's the default gateway for my management network? What's my primary DNS? What is my secondary DNS? For IPMI, KVM, things like that, serial over LAN, you have a range of IP addresses on the fabric interconnects for management. So here's the start and end number. And then we get to some of the administrative details where I can identify the description, the owner, the site, and the DNS domain for this UCS system, along with the system name. Also then time zone that I'm in, and then any NTP servers that I might be using in the environment. And then I list every other default available in UCS. Most people will just leave those alone, but it does give you then the option to go in and modify those defaults. Also here I give you the ability to modify that concatenation of information. For example, I talked about things like the MAC address pools, and I said it's 0025B5. Well, it doesn't have to be, so if you'd like to edit that, you could. Here's that UCS domain ID. Then here is the 2-digit number that was in that array we were just looking at, like 36 for the management pool above, and then that range 00 through FF. So this is where each one of those pools is identified. So again, for the most case, you don't have to change anything. Then if you happen to have kind of a non-standard deployment, you can put some special notes in here, and you can call a customization script if you'd like, which will add custom features beyond the basics of my answer file. So with that said, it's time to go ahead and build ourselves a UCS domain. So I'm going to come over here to the Add UCS Domain script, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull this information up here and make it full screen here. Let's make it a little bit bigger here so you can see what this is going to look like as it runs through. And I'm going to run the script. So the script's going to start out by giving you a little description of what it's going to do. And it's going to then, after telling you what it's going to do, it's going to validate that the UCS PowerTool, which is the PowerShell module for UCS, is properly loaded. And now it's going to ask you for the configuration file that you would like to use. So basically anything with data dash that's sitting in the scripts folder gets pulled up. And as we can see here, here's the answer file. Lab Emulator 222C is the one that we're going to use, and I'm going to select that one. So now the system actually went through and tried to validate as much as it can that what you put in the answer file is actually correct. No typos, you haven't used spaces where spaces aren't allowed, you haven't made things too long, all of that. So it says, okay, I believe this to be a valid data file. And remember, it knew the IP address for your UCS domain because that was in your answer file. So now it's going to ask you to log into your UCS. So now I'm going to type in my super secret password here, hit OK, and it's now going to do a login to my UCS domain. And then it's going to show me a little bit of information to make sure that what I want to do is really using the correct answer file against the correct UCS domain, because it could go really bad if I were to try to reconfigure a already running UCS domain. So this is showing me here on the screen what the IP address is, the name of that system, and any details. And as we can see, this is my factory fresh UCS platform emulator with no details in it, so I can feel pretty comfortably that I can go forward and say, yes, I would like to go ahead and configure the system. So once I hit yes, the system's going to start doing its work. Now the first thing I do is, since I know this is a UCS emulator, is I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to pull a bunch of the default pools out, all that stuff I said that was at the beginning. So if we notice down here, the server pools, the UID pools, they all disappeared. A bunch of the other defaults disappeared. If we go look at the LAN side, we see that those IP pools all disappeared. So I pull the defaults out. I pulled that sub-org out called finance. But now once that's been done, the system starts building all of the other settings. So If we go over here, let's start on the Equipment tab, and let's just look at our Ethernet ports real quick, and let's see what we've got going on here. Let's go to our primary, and we have, again, the server ports, but now we have the network ports that I identified, 29 through 32. I leave Fibre Channel to the end of the script since Fibre Channel has to reboot the Fabric Interconnect or the module. So we'll come back to that here in just a moment. If we go over to servers, we notice now that I've built my 2 customized basic and performance BIOS policies. We've built my boot from hard drive. We've built the entire matrix of boot policies for boot from SAN and for iSCSI. If we just click on one of these and go look at it, we can see that it took the information around my VHBA name. It took all the information about the order of the boot, put that in here as a description, and it listed the appropriate WWPNs. Remember, this one's Fibre Channel 1526 in my example. I made the last digit here match what the port number was, so you can see that it actually picked 1526 correctly. As we go through and look at the rest of the config, we see that we're using our default firmware policy. We have an admin and read-only IPMI policy. We've got our local disk policy for every possible combination of RAID or no RAID that you might want. We've gone in and built a user acknowledgement maintenance policy, and we've changed the default policy to also use user acknowledgement. Since that is controlling the reboot of servers, we want to make sure that those don't happen automatically or immediately. We go in and we look at things like our scrub policy has been customized. Serial over LAN has settings in it. We have pool qualifications and policies built for all of my rack and blade servers. And with that said, then if we go down here, I've automatically built my all servers pool, which has my qualification policies in here, and it actually contains all of the servers. Were automatically added dynamically using my policies to add all those servers in. We have a UUID pool in here called UUID pool that has my pool range with that FF identifying the domain. If we go over to the LAN tab, if we start at the top here, we'll notice now we have my port channel with the proper name and the proper ports living in it. If we go look at the B fabric, we have the same thing that took place on the B fabric. We notice we have a full range of VLANs that have been created here in the environment based on my answer file. If we scroll down a little bit here, we'll notice from the bottom up, here's all the MAC pools that got built, and if we just sample click on some of these, we can see what's in them. That we have the 0025B5, there's that FF for the domain identifier. Here's DA for my data NIC, and the 00 through FF. If we go up and look at my templates, it built all the templates the way we wanted to. Here's my backup NIC, and if we look at my backup NIC, it is using my B fabric with failover to the A fabric, so that was that B-A in the matrix. There's my jumbo MTU. There it's using the backup MAC pool, and there's it's using the QoS policy. And if we look at the information around the VLANs being used, this one has backup in it. If we go look at my VM network, this is the one that if we look at the VLANs, we'll notice that had multiple VLANs trunked into it based on the matrix of the answer file. And then we look at, there's my QoS policies have been set. If we go up here and look at the system QoS, we can see the ones that I had identified and any customizations that I had done. And then finally, I bundled these together with my LAN connectivity policy, bringing all my VNICs together and putting them into a bundle for my regular VNICs or my iSCSI VNICs, where I also then have those iSCSI NICs get identified. Going over to the SAN tab, we see that the system has gone in and built my port channel for the A fabric. It has done hopefully the same thing here on my B fabric. Here we go. And then if we look at the vSANs, we have our vSAN 100, 101 with our FCOE VLANs 1100 and 1101. We get down and we look at our pools, and we have our WWPN pool in here for the Fabric A and Fabric B. Based on our answer file, we notice that that's using again our domain ID and then AA to identify the A fabric, BB for the B fabric. We have our WWNN pool, and then here are those two VHBAs that got built. One for the A fabric using my vSAN A with my Fabric A pool and my Fibre Channel QoS, and then B fabric using all of the B information for vSAN B, Fabric B, and again Fibre Channel. And then we'll go over here and look at the admin tab. We notice that we now have the proper time zone and NTP server from the answer file. We go to our management interfaces. It filled in all the details from the answer file, and then we get to DNS management, and it's put the proper DNS servers in there, removing the default one. And then if we really kind of wrap this all up here, let's go to our equipment tab. We go to our expansion module. We see now that ports were converted from Ethernet to Fibre Channel, and that's how they got used in the environment. So we can see that those got set, and that's how our Fibre Channel port channels got built up using those ports. And then finally, it built a series of templates for your workloads called service profile templates for all the different ways that you might want to boot. And it contains, if we go scrubbing through here, it's using our UID pool, it's using our all servers pool, with our user acknowledgement maintenance policy, with our IP management pool. We see from a storage perspective our two VHBAs using our VHBA SAN policy. From the network side, here's our 10 NICs that got built with our vNICs connectivity policy. Since this one is for Fibre Channel, there's no vNIC for iSCSI, but if we go down and look at our iSCSI boot from service profile template, we see that that does exist. In this one, if we look at our boot policy, since this one's our boot from iSCSI, we see that it's got our iSCSI NICs identified. If we go back here and look at our Fibre Channel one, and we go to our boot order, we see that it's using the 1526, a nice description of what that looks like, and then let's open that up, and we see all the details around our boot policy. And then finally we dig into things like, here is our serial over LAN policy, which I've said don't use serial over LAN. Here's that scrub policy saying don't scrub, but we built all those other policies. Here's the no capping policy that I built for power. Here's our admin IPMI policy. Here's the default firmware policy, and then finally our performance BIOS policy. So it took me much longer to actually walk through the description of what the script was doing than it actually took to do. It took approximately 3 minutes, maybe a little bit less, for it to build this entire UCS domain. Okay, so now that the UCS system has completed its build, we can go in here and take our service profile templates, our workload templates, and we can start deploying servers. So as we can see here, I'll just go ahead and select my first Fibre Channel boot. Let's create some service profiles. In this case, we'll go ahead and just call it, say, server, and we could build something like 20 of those and say OK. And we give the system here just a few minutes, and it's going to deploy 20 servers. And then I could repeat that by grabbing the next template, the next template, the next template, the next template, and I could deploy 160 servers in a matter of minutes. So I think what we're seeing here is after racking and stacking, probably in the neighborhood of 15-20 minutes, I could have my UCS domain set up in a position where I could be deploying servers and ready to go. So thanks for watching the video. Look back for more videos coming soon.